What's up everybody, welcome back to another episode of Outlawed Motors. Today we're not talking about the engine build specifically, but prepping your car to make sure you're not putting your engine into a rusty piece of crap. If you've watched an episode or two in the past, you know that the level of detail and the degree in which I can get into things is obsessive to say the least. That being said, with the engine out for as long as it was, I got into a bunch of while you're in there projects. One of them specifically was getting rid of rust and prepping the chassis. Now, if you saw one of my past episodes on sandblasting and powder coating the front subframe, that's where it all kind of started. I realized that there was a bit of rust on some of the chassis and suspension parts in the front and decided to get them blasted and powder coated over at JP's at Strip Tech. Once I had gotten those off, I realized that there was a bunch of nicks and scratches in the engine bay from removing the engine, as well as some rust that had formed under the engine mounts that I wanted to get rid of. So while the engine was out, I decided to completely restore the engine bay back to its original color and make everything nice and shiny. Now, when it came to the engine bay, I didn't want to just cover up the nicks and scratches when the engine was coming out, and there had been some rust that was starting to form under the engine mounts. So the first step to removing any rust or doing any prep is wire wheeling and using some soft to medium abrasive materials such as Scotch-Brite pads, then cleaning off any areas with a isopropyl alcohol as well as tacky cloth to make sure that no dust or residues were lying around. Now, I found it rather difficult to find the proper steps to chassis restoration, but I figured in certain areas of the car there was different appropriate ways to restore the paint and the chassis. For the engine bay, since I was restoring it to color, I decided to use a etching primer first, then a high build, then a primer sealer, then after that use a one-shot color and clear coat paint that I got mixed up to finish it off. Now, the etching primer is important because you are taking it down to the bare metal. You need to make sure that the paint adheres to the metal. Etching primer kind of digs itself into the metal and allows for any other layers of paint to go on nicely. The purpose of the high build sanding primer, from my knowledge, is to get a nice, beautiful finish when you put the color and the clear coat on top. And then the primer sealer was just an extra measure to make sure that rust wasn't going to come back, and also beautifies the finish as well just a little bit more. I don't know if I would feel comfortable about doing this process on an exterior body panel yet, but I'm curious eventually to do it. But for something that is on the outside that everybody's going to see, I'm sure my skills and the level of which I'm doing things is not good enough for the aesthetics on the outside. However, it didn't stop there. When I was in the exhaust tunnel adding the short shifter, which we'll get to in a future episode, I realized that on spot welds there was some rust had formed, as well as some air pockets that had been forming on other welds. Now, for the exhaust tunnel, the process is a little bit different. However, it is pretty much the same in terms of the rust removal. I used an etching primer first. I used a high build primer, which was completely unnecessary given that it's not going to be seen. However, it doesn't really hurt. And then after that, instead of using a one-shot color, since it definitely doesn't matter, and because there is exhaust heat radiating off of the exhaust, I used a high temperature VHT chassis paint, which is rated to about 121 degrees or 250 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure you have ample paint, primer, and any disposable supplies that you may need. You don't want to be stuck in the middle of priming and run out of paint, especially with the VHT high temp paint. If you read the instructions, you need to make sure that you put all of the coats within an hour, otherwise you can't touch it for 7 days, and you don't want to be stuck in that situation. That's not even the half of it though. My real mistake was when I got into the rear of the car and realized that the rear subframe and suspension areas had completely rusted out. I'm talking about rust flaking off, paint just chipping away, and I just couldn't stand putting as much work as I have in the front and leaving the back completely untouched. So of course I had to completely disassemble the rear of the car which pretty much made the car stripped down to its chassis, which is not somewhere where I wanted to be, but I wanted to know that I had protected my investment, and knowing that this is my forever car, this is the first car I owned, and probably will never sell it. I wanted the peace of mind knowing that I had killed all of the rust and building this car to the specs that I wanted to. Now the problem was, once I dropped the rear subframe, I should have known this was coming, but there was a ton of rust on the actual chassis of the car, which had me more worried because sheet metal dissolving away, well, it's never a good thing. So I got to inspecting under the rear subframe and realized that the rust had spread all the way from the rear subframe under the gas tank, which then required removing the gas tank. You can see how this turns into a little bit of a downward spiral when you see one spot of major rust and then start to try to address all of it. Now, I've never done any of this before. I've done some angle grinding and wire wheeling on my BMW to remove rust, but I've never treated rust afterwards. I've just taken rust off and let it form again. I know some of you have seen the BMW with the surface rust and said that the car is ruined. It's not. It can totally be treated. Anyways, small tangent. When it came to the rear, dropping the subframe, I realized that there was a few different ways that I could go about treating the rear. I could either use Por 15, however, I didn't really feel comfortable with just hiding the problem. I know some people have great success with Por 15, which is a paint over rust paint. I don't really feel great about just hiding the solution because I have seen this stuff chip off, and it will only really use Por 15 for areas that are really hard to address. I found it ideal to be switching between my angle grinder and my die grinder, as the die grinder was a little bit more convenient to get into those nooks and crannies, and the angle grinder was great for the general rust removal, getting a bunch of mass rust off, and then I could work in with the die grinder to get all of the remaining crap out of there. It also doesn't hurt to get a pack of Scotch-Brite pads that you can throw on both your angle grinder and your die grinder, as well as a variety of wire wheels. I found the Scotch-Brite pads highly beneficial for getting paint off and getting a nice smooth finish, where the wire wheels were great for getting just general chunky rust off and sticking into welded areas that were not so easy to get at. Make sure when you're removing rust that you are not messing around with your safety. Proper ventilated mask, protective eyewear, and earplugs don't hurt as well, especially if you're under the car and all of that sound is just echoing in your ears. I'm not kidding, when those wire wheels fly out, they do hurt like a bastard. I found a few in my arm, a few in my forehead, and you don't want metal objects inserted into you at any point, because that's never a good thing, unless that's your thing. Also, if you're like me working horizontally in a single car cramped garage, it also doesn't hurt to have a few light sources as well as proper ventilation. Maybe have a couple fans or one giant fan pushing air out to the front to make sure that rust sediment is not sticking around the atmosphere. And even if you have a proper mask, it's probably not great, and some of that stuff might get in, and you don't want to be breathing that stuff in. After all the rust was removed in the rear under the gas tank and the subframe and the wheel wells and other things like that, I used a self-etching primer like I did in the exhaust tunnel and the engine bay, and this is where I changed things up a little bit. Once all the rust and grit was removed under the gas tank and the rear subframe, I did the same process as I did with the exhaust tunnel and the engine bay and started with a self-etching primer. However, after that, I used a seam sealer to restore any areas that I had grinded off original seams, as well as added seam sealer to any welds that seemed problematic. You don't want to skip out on seam sealer, as it does provide an extra level of protection. I also use seam sealer to fill up plugs that I had accidentally grinded off. It essentially serves the same function as a chassis plug. You also want to be careful with removing any hardware on the underbody of the car. As you are removing rust, there are probably rusty hardware and it's easy for things to snap. So just go easy on things, use a lubricant to penetrate the rust, and hope for the best. For the extremely hard areas to reach on the underbody of the car, such as where the exhaust mounts, once I had cleaned out any rust and loose debris, I used a rust converter to try to convert any rust, as well as used a rust inhibitor with a spray gun and then cleaned it out. It's not the best solution, but it was the best option I had, given that it was so inaccessible to access those areas. I did use a high build primer again, which was unnecessary. However, for this area, since I wasn't going to be heat shielding these areas all entirely, and some of the areas were hidden by the gas tank, I skipped right to a paintable rubberized undercoating. Now, the undercoating should do its job properly and protect that area from future rust and any nicks and scratches from the road. So I'm going to cross my fingers and see how that goes. I did not want to use the rubberized undercoating under the subframe and where the suspension mounted, because I wanted a nice flat surface for the mounts to secure to. For that, what I did was a similar process to the exhaust tunnel. I used a self-etching primer, high build, and then on top of that, I used a VHT high temperature chassis paint, just because it's going to be a little bit more durable than a lot of the other alternatives. Once it was all painted and treated, it was time for the beautifully powder coated subframe and rear suspension parts to go back in. One of the errors that I made, which I hope you learned from my mistakes, is I was not careful with the brake lines when I was removing the rear subframe and ended up destroying them. I was trying to take the brake lines off and pretty much sheared off the brake line and had to bend new ones. I had never done it before, but I used a copper nickel and pretty much just bent it by hand, which was super easy. Just make sure you keep the old brake lines so you have a form to bend it with. I just used zip ties to hold the form together and got it as best as I could. Now, with the flares, I didn't really have great success on the trials of flaring my own brake lines, so I took that into a professional to get the proper flare done. You don't want to mess around with your brakes anyways, and it wasn't that expensive. Hopefully some of this information was informative if you're planning on doing something like this to your car. If not, I hope you're laughing at my pain and suffering and enjoying it regardless. If you like this video, make sure you subscribe, give it a thumbs up, and always share. Thanks so much, guys. Have a good one and see you next time.